Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. Authority shows up everywhere in tabletop role-playing games. Kings give orders, priests make demands, patrons point the party in a direction, and commanders expect obedience. But players are also responding to authority at the table itself because the game master frames the world, presents consequences, and signals what seems important. That makes authority in role-playing games more layered than it first appears. Today I want to use the Milgram experiments as a lens for thinking about that dynamic. His work focused on how ordinary people respond when a legitimate seeming authority asks them to do something that conflicts with their conscience, and that gives us a useful way to think about role-playing games as well. How players read authority, when they comply, when they resist, and how the structure of play can shape what feels like the expected course of action. So let's get into it. Stanley Milgram's obedience studies began at Yale University in the early 1960s, with recruitment starting in 1961. His first major published report, Behavioral Study of Obedience, appeared in 1963, and the broader project continued through multiple variations before being synthesized in his 1974 book, Obedience to Authority. In the original published study, Milgram reported on 40 male participants, ages 20 to 50, recruited from New Haven and nearby communities through newspaper ads and direct mail. They were told they were taking part in a study of memory and learning, not obedience. In the basic setup, each volunteer met another apparent participant who was actually in on the experiment. The volunteer was always assigned the role of teacher, while the plant became the learner. The learner was strapped into a chair and connected to what appeared to be an electric shock device, while the teacher sat before a shock generator labeled from 15 to 450 volts, each with increasingly severe verbal warnings. Each time the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher was instructed to administer a stronger shock, though the shocks were in fact fake, but only the teacher didn't know that. The learner reacted to the pain, screamed, and in at least one experiment became non-responsive. The historical context matters here. Milgram's work emerged in the shadow of World War II, and he was trying to investigate how ordinary people could participate in harmful acts under the orders of an authority structure. His goal was to create a laboratory method for studying what he called destructive obedience, and to examine not just whether people obeyed, but under what conditions obedience became more or less likely. In the 1963 paper, Milgram made clear that obedience itself is a normal and often necessary part of social life. The real question was what happens when a seemingly legitimate authority pushes someone toward an act that appears harmful. The results became famous because they were far higher than expected. Milgram and his students predicted that only a tiny percentage would continue to the maximum level, yet in the first official study, 26 of 40 participants, or 65%, went all the way to 450 volts. At the same time, many showed visible strain, hesitation, nervous laughter, and distress. That nuance is important because the experiments were not simply about people obeying authority in the abstract. They were about the interaction of authority, legitimacy, procedure, responsibility, and situational framing. The Milgram studies have faced two major kinds of criticism in the years that followed: ethical criticism and interpretive criticism. Ethically, they are now widely viewed as unacceptable because of the heavy use of deception, the lack of full informed consent, the psychological stress placed on participants, and concerns about debriefing. Interpretively, later scholars have argued that the experiments do not simply prove blind obedience, but instead show that compliance depends on whether people see the authority as legitimate and identify with its goals. Taking together, these criticisms don't erase the importance of Milgram's work, but they do push against any simplistic claim that people automatically surrender agency to authority. For role-playing game purposes, that actually makes the lens more useful, because the better question is not whether players will blindly obey, but what signals make an authority figure seem legitimate, central, reasonable, or difficult to resist. Tabletop role-playing games are full of authority structures, and that authority operates on more than one level. Inside the fiction, players encounter kings, priests, generals, magistrates, patrons, elders, inquisitors, and guild leaders who claim the right to direct action. At the table, players are also responding to procedural authority because the game master frames situations, describes consequences, and signals what the game is prepared to support. The point is not a simplistic claim that people just obey power, it is that authority gains force through legitimacy, procedure, framing, and social context. In Milgram's work, participants were not responding to a command in isolation. They were placed inside a formal setting, shaped by institutional purpose, structured procedure, and an authority figure whose role and demeanor conveyed legitimacy. In tabletop role-playing games, something similar happens whenever a scene communicates that a figure has the recognized right to define what matters and what should happen next. At the table, players respond both to what an authority figure says and how that authority is staged. Crowns, uniforms, holy vestments, holy seals, armed escorts, decrees, ceremonies, councils, and codified rules all help make authority feel embedded in a larger order. Social cues matter too. When everyone in the scene defers to a character, lowers their voice around them, or treats their words as binding, players are more likely to read that figure as legitimate. Competence and certainty add another layer. An authority figure who appears calm, informed, decisive, and morally confident will usually feel more persuasive than one who seems frightened or unsure, even when both are asking for the same thing. These signals do more than color the fiction. They shape how players interpret the space of possible action. That's why player freedom is often more complicated than it first appears. Players may technically be free to ignore the Duke, distrust the priest, or refuse the mission, but they are reading the situation as a game. They're looking for cues about what is central, what is optional, what the GM has prepared in depth, and what seems most likely to keep play moving. Sometimes that creates what we might call soft obedience. Nobody says, you must take this quest, but the framing makes one path feel more legitimate, more supported, and more socially coherent than the others. A duke gets a ceremonial entrance, a patron receives a detailed monologue and obvious plot weight, while other leads pass by quickly or feel underdeveloped. In those moments, the issue is not that players lack agency, it's that the structure of the session can quietly organize agency so that one option feels expected and the others feel thin, awkward, or costly to pursue. That is also why this lens is valuable for design and game mastering. It helps us see that the feeling of freedom and the feeling of expectation can coexist. Players are both choosing inside a fictional world and are also trying to be good participants in a shared activity. They may follow the king's order, trust the suspicious patron, or pursue the brightest hook because that path feels most legible and most fully supported, not necessarily because they were explicitly coerced. So the useful question is, how does presentation, legitimacy, and social framing make one course of action feel natural, central, persuasive, contested, or hard to refuse? Authority is only part of the story because people at the table are also responding to each other. One of the reasons the Milgram experiments still matter is that they help show how hard it can be to resist the momentum of a situation once that situation feels structured, legitimate, and socially underway. Many participants in Milgram's study showed visible signs of tension and conflict, yet a large number continued prompted by the experimenter, which suggests that obedience is often bound up with the discomfort of interruption, refusal, and open resistance inside a charged social setting. In one of the best-known versions of the experiment, 26 of 40 participants went all the way to the maximum voltage level that Milgram presented, even though many were distressed as they did so. This gives us a useful lens for thinking about how difficult it can be to become the person who breaks the flow of what everyone else seems to be accepting. That same pressure shows up in tabletop role-playing games all the time, even in very friendly groups. A player may doubt the patron, dislike the mission, or feel uneasy about the moral direction of the plan, but there is often a strong pull toward going along with the table's emerging consensus. Social psychology has long treated conformity as a process in which people adjust their beliefs, judgments, or actions to align more closely with a group, especially one whose approval matters to them. Research on conformity describes it in exactly those terms, and that's useful here because players are rarely making decisions in a vacuum. They are making them in front of friends, collaborators, and fellow participants whose energy, expectations, and momentum all help shape what feels reasonable in the moment. This means that obedience at the table can come from more than one direction. There is the vertical pressure of fictional or procedural authority, which we have already talked about, and there's also the horizontal pressure of the group itself. A player may think, I don't want to be the one who derails the session, or everyone else seems ready to go, or the game master clearly built tonight around this situation, and I don't want to make things difficult. None of that requires anyone to be domineering. It can arise from simple social cooperation, from politeness, or from the ordinary desire to keep the shared activity moving. In role-playing games, social pressure often works precisely because the group usually values collaboration. There's also an important practical point here. Research associated with conformity experiments found that group judgment can strongly influence individual responses, even in cases where the correct answer seems obvious. In later summaries of conformity, research continued to treat majority influence as a powerful shaper of behavior. For tabletop games, that means resistance often becomes easier when someone else also resists. Doubt becomes easier to voice when it is no longer solitary. Suspicion becomes more playable when another player says, hold on, I'm not sure we should trust this person. That's a very useful thing for game masters to remember, because once a table starts moving in one direction, the social cost of dissent can quickly rise. Players may comply because they agree, because they are uncertain, or because disagreement simply feels heavier than consent in that moment. So if we want to understand obedience in tabletop role-playing games, we have to look beyond the obvious authority figure and pay attention to the social texture of the table itself. Players are responding to instructions, yes, but they are also responding to tone, momentum, consensus, and the emotional cost of becoming the person who says no. A table doesn't need hard coercion for pressure to exist. Sometimes all it needs is a little authority, momentum, and a group that is already leaning in the same direction. One striking thing about the Milgram experiments is that the situation didn't begin with the most extreme act. It unfolded through increments. In the original setup, the shock generator moved upward in 15-volt steps from 15 to 450 volts, and participants were instructed to continue after each incorrect answer by increasing the shock level one stage at a time. That meant that participants were rarely confronting the full moral weight of the situation all at once. They were confronting the next step, then the next one, inside a structured sequence that made continuation easier to normalize. Nearly 80% of the teachers who continued past 150 volts went on to the maximum 450 volts, which gives us a vivid picture of how powerful incremental commitment can become once a person is already inside the process. That pattern maps very well onto campaign play. A party may accept a small, seemingly reasonable task from an authority figure. Then that task widens. At first, the messenger is just escorted. Now the group is asked to read a private letter. Then they are asked to watch someone in secret, then to steal records, then to intimidate or eliminate a witness, then to help cover up what they have learned because too much is already in motion. If that entire chain had been presented at the beginning, many groups might reject it immediately. Presented step by step, though, each new action can feel like a continuation of what the party is already doing. The pressure comes from momentum. Once players have said yes to the first piece, later refusals can feel heavier. They may feel that their characters are already committed, that the group is already involved, that backing out now would create greater problems than continuing, or that the story has built enough inertia that stopping feels less natural than pressing forward. Milgram's procedure gives us a helpful lens for this because the experimental structure itself encouraged people to experience the situation as a sequence of manageable continuations, instead of one giant irreversible leap. For game masters and designers, that has two important implications. First, gradual escalation is powerful because it can create morally complex play without railroading. Second, it means we should pay attention to the way campaign structures can train compliance over time. A game can slowly move players into choices they would have questioned more sharply if those choices had arrived fully formed at the outset. If one side of this discussion is obedience, the other is resistance. In many groups, resistance is common. Players mock kings, distrust priests, test patrons, evade officials, lie to magistrates, and treat institutions with suspicion. In some genres, that suspicion is practically part of the atmosphere. Grim fantasy often teaches players that nobles are compromised, inquisitors are dangerous, and official stories are incomplete. Cyberpunk almost assumes institutional distrust from the start. Even in more traditional fantasy, players often learn that the polished authority figure is exactly the person they should question. The better question is, what conditions make obedience more likely, and what conditions make resistance feel viable? That richer version fits the broader obedience research as well. Variations on Milgram's experiment showed that compliance dropped under some conditions, especially when the authority structure weakened or when peers resisted. For role-playing game purposes, that is relevant because resistance is situational, relational, and heavily shaped by context. Players are more likely to push back when the authority figure seems corrupt, hypocritical, self-serving, or incompetent. When the campaign world has taught them that institutions are unreliable, when the table culture values skepticism and independence, and when dissent actually leads somewhere. If challenging the Duke opens new paths, changes alliances, and produces playable consequences, resistance becomes a live option. If questioning the Duke simply stalls the session, obedience starts to feel structurally favored. That's one of the most practical takeaways here. Authority doesn't shape play through rank alone. It also depends on whether alternatives are visible, supported, and meaningful. There's also another side to this, and it helps explain why some groups swing so hard in the opposite direction. Tabletop role-playing games create a strange condition where authority can be challenged with far fewer real-life costs than in ordinary social life. A player can insult the Duke, rob the temple, stab the magistrate, or burn down the guild hall without risking their actual livelihood, safety, or reputation. Because the consequences are fictional and mediated, some players feel newly free to reject hierarchy, mock it, or attack it. Sometimes that becomes what people call the murder hobo style of play, but even that is often more interesting than pure randomness. In many cases, it grows out of a campaign world that has failed to make institutions feel socially real. If towns have no memory, factions don't react coherently, law has no procedural weight, and every authority figure feels disposable, players quickly learn that they can kick over the scenery. In that sense, anti-authority behavior can become the inverse of Milgram's setup. Instead of the environment reinforcing obedience through legitimacy and structure, the game environment teaches disobedience by making authority feel hollow, inconsistent, or consequence-free. I once had a campaign where the players had already experienced the consequences of my setting's legal system. They knew the authorities were real, organized, and capable of following through. They had seen how my courts worked. They understood that arrest was not just a temporary inconvenience, and they knew being taken into custody could lead to serious punishment. At one point, the authorities cornered them on a bridge. They had a clear understanding of the situation. Surrender meant arrest and a return to the court system they already feared. And in that moment, instead of giving themselves up, they chose to leap from the bridge and risk death in an attempt to escape. That choice makes sense because the authority in the setting felt legitimate and consequential. The law was more than just background scenery. It had structure, memory, and weight. The players believed capture was serious enough that a desperate, life-threatening escape felt like the better option. And that's exactly the kind of thing I mean when I say authority becomes dramatically powerful when the world makes it feel real. The pressure didn't come from me forcing them down one path. It came from the fact that the setting had already taught them what surrender meant, and they responded to that pressure by making a risky, character-defining choice. At its best, though, resistance to authority can be one of the most cathartic things role-playing games offer. Games give players a space to confront power, reject coercion, expose hypocrisy, protect the vulnerable, or say no to institutions that feel overwhelming, unjust, or untouchable in real life. That doesn't mean every act of rebellion is politically deep or emotionally profound. Sometimes it's just chaotic play. But when the world reacts in meaningful ways, anti-authority play can become dramatically rich, morally complicated, and deeply satisfying. It can let players test courage, solidarity, conscience, and defiance in a shared imaginative space. It can offer the pleasure of speaking back to power, the relief of refusing a corrupt system, or the emotional release of helping a character do what real people often cannot do safely in ordinary life. That's where resistance becomes more than friction or vandalism. It becomes drama, agency, and sometimes catharsis. So, the strongest version of this argument is that both obedience and resistance are shaped by legitimacy, context, group culture, consequence, and the visible structure of alternatives. Players comply under some conditions, defy under others, and often move back and forth depending on how authority is presented and how real the world makes that authority feel. That's what makes the Milgram lens useful for tabletop role-playing games. It helps us ask why power works, why it fails, and why resisting it can sometimes feel as dramatically important as obeying it. In hierarchical settings, people often explain harmful action by locating the source of that action somewhere above themselves. Milgram's original paper explicitly framed the experiment as coming from the fact that many participants continued to administer what they believed were painful shocks, while the authority figure defined the procedure as necessary and proper. That is fertile ground for RPG play because so many game structures are built around hierarchy. Political campaigns, military fantasy, espionage stories, inquisitorial narratives, dystopian settings, and dark fantasy worlds all create situations where characters may do harm under orders from a crown, church, state, commander, or sacred code. In those structures, authority can function as a kind of moral buffer. A character may not think of themselves as cruel. They may think of themselves as dutiful, loyal, disciplined, lawful, or faithful. The command helps absorb some of the moral weight. I was just following orders becomes a way of making the action feel less personal. What makes this dramatically rich is it opens a whole chain of character questions. Does the character believe obedience is itself a moral good? Do they treat legality and morality as the same thing, or do they feel the gap between them? At what point does service to the institution stop feeling clean? When does "I was told to" stop being enough? Those questions can push the character away from abstract alignment labels and into conscience, complicity, and accountability. Milgram's work doesn't answer those questions for us, but it gives us an interesting way of thinking about asking them, since the core issue is both whether someone obeys and how they understand their own responsibility while obeying. This is one of the reasons authority-heavy campaigns can produce such strong role-playing. They create room for characters to discover where their moral thresholds actually are. A soldier may follow orders for a long time and then break when civilians are threatened. An inquisitor may accept brutality in the name of purity until the accused is someone innocent, familiar, or sympathetic. A spy may justify manipulation as service to the realm until the mission demands betrayal that feels too personal to rationalize. It's about when obedience begins to feel like complicity and when accountability can no longer be handed upward to the institution that gave the order. That's where authority acts both as a plot device and becomes a crisis of conscience. The goal isn't to remove authority from tabletop RPGs. Authority gives games momentum, conflict, hierarchy, and dramatic weight. The real goal is to understand how authority shapes player behavior so it can be used with intention. For game masters, that means deciding when authority should feel compelling and when it should feel questionable. A crown, a church, a commander, or a sacred law can all create strong dramatic pressure, but that pressure works best when it leaves room for meaningful response. Give authority figures visible limits, flaws, and competing viewpoints. Make refusal, negotiation, reinterpretation, delay, and rebellion lead somewhere real. Give alternative paths enough legitimacy that they feel playable, and separate what matters to the world from what is required for the campaign. The point isn't to force obedience, it's to create believable pressure so that the player's response reveals character. The value isn't in tricking players into bad outcomes. The value is in understanding how legitimacy, procedure, ritual, confidence, and institutional backing can place characters in morally charged situations. A military order issued in a war room with officers at attention and maps spread across the table lands differently from the same request made casually in a tavern. A priest's command spoken during a sacred rite lands differently from the same words whispered in private. Those signals make authority feel real, and that reality gives weight to the player's choices. Do they obey out of duty, hesitate out of doubt, resist out of conscience, rationalize the order, split the party, or search for a third path. Authority becomes a story engine when it sharpens moral choice instead of replacing it. This works especially well when both sides of a conflict carry some legitimacy. A queen may order a crackdown that feels politically necessary but morally ugly. A rebel leader may call for sabotage in the name of justice while risking innocent lives. A guildmaster may demand silence to prevent panic while a witness begs the party to expose the truth. Those situations work because authority is more than just an obstacle. It becomes a claim on the character's loyalty, judgment, and conscience. The structure of command can make obedience feel normal, responsible, and even virtuous until someone stops to ask what they are actually doing. Some players have a strong resistance to authority, both in fiction and at the table. When a king gives an order, a guild demands loyalty, or a commander tries to impose duty, those players may reject the authority on principle. Sometimes that is a character choice. They may be playing a rebel, an outlaw, or someone who distrusts institutions. Sometimes it's coming from the player side. Those players don't like feeling pushed, managed, or bound to a path they didn't choose. When that happens, even a gentle attempt by the game master to move the party in a certain direction can be read as pressure, and the player may resist both the NPC and the structure behind the scene. That's important because the resistance isn't always about the content of the request. A player like this may reject an order even when it's reasonable, morally sound, or clearly useful. What they are pushing against is the feeling that authority is closing down freedom. In practice, that means any in-fiction tie to hierarchy, duty, oath, law, command, or institutional expectation may trigger resistance if it feels like an attempt to bind the character. For a game master, the lesson isn't to crush that resistance or treat it as a problem by default. It's to recognize that some players are especially sensitive to how authority is framed. They often respond better when they can negotiate, reinterpret, or choose their own reasons for action instead of feeling drafted into obedience. Players can use this lens also. It helps to ask why an authority figure feels persuasive in the moment. Is this what my character truly believes? Does this seem like the only viable path because of the fiction or because of how the situation has been framed? Am I agreeing because the group expects it, because the game master has signaled it as central, or because I have genuinely chosen it? Questions like these make pressure easier to notice and assumptions easier to test. They can also lead to richer roleplay around obedience, resistance, doubt, complicity, and conscience. Good roleplay doesn't require resisting authority at every turn. Sometimes obedience is exactly the right choice for the character and the story. What matters is recognizing that obedience is still a choice, not an invisible default. The best use of this lens is to create tension rather than submission. Present authority with enough force that compliance feels understandable, but keep other responses genuinely playable. Let refusal open story instead of closing it. Let dissent carry consequences, but meaningful ones. When that balance is right, authority is less railroad and more drama. It becomes a way to generate crises of conscience, divided loyalties, and memorable turning points. So now let's look at a practical guide for game masters to applying these principles at the table. The Milgram lens is useful for tabletop RPGs because it helps us see that authority doesn't shape player behavior through rank alone. It shapes behavior through legitimacy, framing procedures, social pressure, visible alternatives, and the way responsibility is distributed inside a situation. That means the practical question isn't, how do I make players obey? The question is, how do I build authority so that player response becomes dramatically meaningful? Used well, this creates tension, conscience, resistance, loyalty, and catharsis. Used poorly, it creates fake choice, shallow compliance, or friction without weight. So first, identify the source of authority. Start by asking who or what is claiming the right to direct action in the scene. This might be a king, a priest, a commander, a law, sacred text, a guild, court, military order, or institution. Then ask how the players will recognize that claim as legitimate. Titles, uniforms, ritual language, decrees, official seals, ceremonies, architecture, and escorts all help communicate authority. So do confidence, competence, and certainty. And then ask, what makes this authority feel real? Frame the scene deliberately. Authority is about both what is said and how it is presented. A command delivered in a war room, during a ritual, or before a court carries different weight than the same command delivered casually. If one path gets the dramatic entrance, the long speech, and the most detail, players will often read that as the central path. And then ask, am I presenting this as one option or as the obvious option? Decide whether authority should feel trusted, questionable, or ambiguous. Not every authority figure should land the same way. If you want players to trust an institution, give them reasons. If you want them to doubt it, show flaws, contradictions, corruption, fear, or competing testimony. Let the world teach players how seriously to take power and on what terms. And then ask, what response do I want this authority to invite? Make alternatives visible. If obedience is the only well-supported path, then resistance is mostly theoretical. Players are more likely to question authority when other paths are legible and playable. That might mean rival factions, loopholes, an investigation, delay, negotiation, exposure, or a meaningful refusal that still keeps the game moving. And then ask, if the players say no, what happens next? Use escalation on purpose. Authority often becomes powerful through sequence. A small request leads to a larger one. A compromise becomes a pattern. A party agrees to carry a letter, then spy on someone, then seize records, then protect the system that ordered it all. Step-by-step pressure can move characters into moral territory they might have rejected if it had been presented all at once. And then ask, where does this start and where might it lead? Track responsibility. Authority-heavy campaigns become much richer when responsibility is not left vague. Characters acting under orders may shift moral weight upward. A soldier may call it duty, a priest may call it doctrine, a spy may call it service. Build moments that force responsibility back into view. A prisoner might ask, do you believe this, or were you told to do it? An ally might challenge the party's reasoning. A subordinate might hesitate. And then ask, who is carrying the moral burden here? Watch social pressure at the table. Players are both reacting as characters and are also reacting as a group. A player may comply because everyone else seems ready to move, because the game master appears to be pointing in one direction, or because dissent feels awkward. That pressure may be subtle, but it is real. Make it clear that questioning authority is playable. When resistance opens the story wider, players learn that agency is real. When resistance stalls the session, players learn that obedience is safer. And then ask, does the table feel free to push back? Separate direction from railroading. Games need direction. They need hooks, stakes, urgency, and momentum. The problem isn't strong authority. The problem is when necessity is disguised as choice. Legitimate direction offers pressure, incentives, and consequences while still leaving room for refusal, negotiation, reinterpretation, delay, or rebellion. And then ask, if the players resist, does the story continue in a real way? Treat resistance as meaningful play. Resistance isn't a failure state. Many groups are skeptical of authority by default, and some games actively encourage that skepticism. Resistance can produce some of the strongest play in a campaign, especially when the world reacts in believable ways. If institutions feel hollow and consequence-free, anti-authority play can collapse into shallow chaos. If the world responds coherently, rebellion can become morally complex, emotionally engaging, and even cathartic. And then ask, does resisting power create drama or just noise? Show multiple responses to authority. Don't let the world collapse into a single stance. Show loyalists, true believers, cynics, fearful subordinates, quiet resistors, opportunists, and disillusioned insiders. This gives players a richer moral field and makes authority feel socially real. And then ask, how do different people in this world respond to power? Build for tension, not submission. The strongest use of this lens isn't to force obedience. It is to create situations where authority feels real enough that the player's response matters. Obedience should mean something. Resistance should mean something. Negotiation, compromise, delay, and rebellion should also mean something. When that balance is right, authority becomes a story engine. It creates divided loyalties, moral tension, crises of conscience, dramatic reversals, and memorable turning points. And then ask, am I using authority to replace choice or to sharpen it? So here's a quick Game Master checklist. Before running an authority-heavy scene, ask, who holds authority here? What makes that authority feel legitimate? How is the scene framing the request? Are alternatives visible and playable? What happens if the players refuse? How might pressure escalate over time? Who seems morally responsible? Is social pressure narrowing the choice? Are dissent and obedience both meaningful? Will the world react in a coherent way? So when we look at the Milgram experiments through the lens of tabletop role-playing games, the real value is that authority, legitimacy, framing, and social pressure all shape how choices are experienced at the table. That gives us a better way to think about obedience, resistance, complicity, and agency in play. And I think that makes for better game mastering, better design, and richer roleplay. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. When have you seen authority shape player choices at your table in interesting ways? Let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.